Welcome to this tutorial on rigid bodies in Blender. Rigid bodies are a super useful tool. They're a physics simulation tool, and they essentially let things collide that don't deform, or simple things like that. So you can imagine a brick hitting the ground, ping pong balls, all that kind of stuff. Super easy to do with rigid bodies. So to demo this, I'm going to do a little scene of some cereal into a bowl. So I think that's, pretty nice scene to do. So I want the cereal to be sort of like a Cheerio, like donut shaped. So I'm going to do this. I'm at a torus, keep it fairly low poly. I'm a half these, and that's pretty low poly. So let's increase the minor radius to something a bit bigger so it has a smaller hole in the middle. Go ahead and go to the physics panel. I'm going to add a rigid body object to this. There's two types of rigid bodies in Blender. There's active and passive, and essentially an active body will be affected by gravity and is intended to move throughout the scene. A passive body just isn't intended to move. It won't be affected by gravity. It'll just sort of stick in place. Set the collision shape to be something that makes sense for the object that you're doing. Convex hull might work pretty well for this, but you can always use, say, a box. You'll notice that it won't be able to collide properly on the edges. It will just collide as if it was a box, which, might not be the most realistic, but it will definitely be easier to simulate. I think for this, maybe a cylinder would work pretty well because it approximates the shape very well and we don't need to worry about this hole in the middle. And I am going to start duplicating this up a bunch of times. But first I'm going to scale it down to be something a little bit more cereal-like, even though, it's never going to be perfect. I'm also going to apply the scale after I've scaled it down, just so that it's all at 1 and the physics prefers it that way. Now I'm going to use Alt-D on the keyboard, duplicate this torus, and I'm just going to duplicate this like a bunch of times, and each time I do it I'm going to grab all the other ones so we get like exponentially more. This all really depends, how much cereal you want in your virtual bowl. Let's try that. Okay, I'm going to add a plane, scale this up, and this is just to test the rigid bodies on here, test the collisions and everything, just so you can get a little feel for it. So I'm going to add a rigid body to the plane. What I want is this plane not to move, so I'm going to set it to passive, based on what we talked about earlier. I'm going to restart the simulation, and you can see we get a bunch of Cheerios falling onto the floor, which is a sight you never want to see, really. But that runs pretty much in real time. It's pretty realistic. There's a little bit of jittering occurring. This is just a problem with the system in Blender, really. There's not a whole lot you can do about it. It's kind of annoying. Sometimes tweaking the mass, tweaking the scale, tweaking the damping can help. Playing with all of these settings here. But now you'll notice a problem that if we want to change one of these parameters, we're obviously not going to go ahead and change them on all of these. It's easier just to actually select all the objects you want to do, then adjust the parameter, then press F3 and type in rigid body copy from active, and then assuming we've done this correctly, yep, now you can see they all have the same parameter, and you can do that with any parameter. So that's a really useful way of doing that. And let's see if higher friction reduces the jittering a little bit. Okay, that's interesting. It's a little better, I think. I think another setting I'm going to adjust is the dampening here. And basically what this does is it's just sort of a fake cheat that will try and settle everything down for you. It's not physically accurate, and if you set it too high, it can really make your simulations look unrealistic, like energy just sort of disappears from them. But here I think it's worth bumping it up a little bit. I'm going to put it to 0.1 maybe. And then I am going to hit F3 again, copy from active, and then I'm going to hit play, let it simulate. Okay, I think this is going to work pretty well. I'm not sure you'll necessarily notice the jittering from where we're going to be rendering it from. Cool. So let's go ahead, and instead of having them fall onto a plane, let's grab all of these, move them up. Another thing to note is that I can only move these on frame 0. I have to do it before the simulation starts, otherwise I won't be able to move them. Now I'm going to model up a quick bowl really quickly. I'm going to start with a cylinder and just sort of move this up to the origin. And a useful tool for moving things so the origin is at the bottom of them is when you add stuff in Blender, it's always one unit tool. So if you press G to move stuff and then Z and then you hold Control to enable snapping, you can just move things up one unit basically. So things are 2 units tools, so when you move them up 1 unit, it moves it up by half, which puts the origin at the bottom, which is pretty useful for all sorts of modeling. So now I'm going to go ahead and try and make this into a little bowl. I'm going to scale out the top, add a loop on the side, pull it out a little bit, maybe put one closer down here and give it a little bit of a like a rim kind of thing. Yeah, do something like that. And then I'm going to press Control 2 to enable subdivision surface, and you can see it looks terrible. So I'm going to grab this top face, delete it, grab this bottom face, inset it a couple times, and now we have a much nicer bowl. I'll shade it smooth, and then I'm going to go ahead and add a modifier. I'm going to add a solidify. I'm going to apply a scale, give it a little bit of more thickness than this. I'm going to add an edge right near the top so we avoid some of those shading artifacts. And then I'll just scale it in until that's roughly flat. Let's give it a rigid body. I'm going to make this passive again because it's not going to be moving. And for our shape here, we actually want to use mesh, because if we use anything else, it's going to basically give us fill in this face at the top, so things will just bounce off it. So if I play it now, you can see nothing will actually go into it because it doesn't recognize the volume of it. So I'm going to set this to mesh. And then play it through, and we do get some weirdness of stuff sort of clipping it, and that's because it's not taking into account the subdivision surface. It's doing it on the unsubdivided model, and it's also not taking into account the solidify. So you can see if we turn those two off, it's working pretty well. So to fix this, I'm just going to apply the solidify first with Control A. Then I'm going to come onto the subdivision. I'm going to turn it down to 1, and then I'm going to Control A, apply it. The system can see everything accurately. And we get some that fall over the top. That's pretty neat. Bouncing around. All that. That's good. And now we can just hit Control 1 again and give it a subdivision just to smooth it out for the render. But the physics sees the lower poly version. And that's just for optimization reasons. And then I'm just going to set up a little render setup for this. Nothing too crazy. I'm just going to give this bowl like a basic white shader. Turn off scene world here. And yeah, give it this like porcelain look. Then for these Cheerios, I'm going to put them all in their own collection because the outline is super messy at the minute. Scroll all the way up. Grab all these, not the plane. Deselect the plane. Put these into a collection. I'll call it cereal. And then I'm going to hit Control 2 on all these objects. This might freeze your Blender for a second because we're adding a subdivision to all these objects, but it'll be fine. Then you can right click and shade smooth all these. And now they all look like Cheerios, not like low poly donuts. Nice. I'm going to save my file too, actually. That's always a good idea. Now I want to give some materials to these Cheerios. So I'm going to, with them all selected, add a material. Call it Cheerio. And then I am going to press Control L, link materials with all of them selected. And now they'll all have that shader. And it looks like I've also had the plane selected, so that's not good. I'm going to remove that. Like that. And I'm going to give the plane its own shader. I'm just going to call it wood. And Cheerios are not red. They're more this color. But we want to do something a little more sophisticated for this. And I'm going to be rendering this in cycles too. So I'll go ahead and set that up. For these Cheerio shaders, the first thing I'm going to look at is the bump. So I'm going to do this procedurally just with a simple noise texture. I'm going to plug it into a bump node into the height input. And that will just act as a displacement map. You can see this doesn't look very good at the minute. And the reason for that is we've got this stretching on this and it's way too intense, not enough detail in it either. So to solve the stretching, I'm going to press Control T on this node with the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. And then I am going to change from generated coordinates to object. And this will give it a more uniform scale. Then I'm going to come in and I'm going to set the scale to something quite high. I'm also going to bump up the detail to 8. Turn up the roughness. And then I'm going to turn down this distance parameter so that the bump is less intense. I'm also going to turn down the strength to dial it in. Maybe come back on the scale a bit. And then I want to randomize the color between these Cheerios so they're not all exactly the same shade. So I'm going to go into Object Info. I'm going to use a random attribute on this. Put it through a ramp. And then we can choose our colors here. You see we get a shade of gray for each one at the minute. So I'm going to set this color ramp to constant. So now you can see it's a binary choice between the colors we put on here. And the sort of size determines the probability here, so you can see if I have a lot of red, it will pick red more often. And I'm just going to find an image of some Cheerios. They are kind of the shade we had, but they're just a little bit more orange and some extra variation in there and that kind of stuff. So that's cool. Let's do that. Actually, let's set this back to ease and just let them pick shades in between. That'll be nice. But if you wanted to do, say, multicolored Cheerios, setting it to constant would be a good idea. Also, I'm going to add another modifier to these Cheerios. I'm going to add a displacement. Because these are just perfectly round at the minute. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So if I add a displace modifier on one of them, and I'm just going to press number pad / to isolate this, just so I can see what I'm working on a bit better. I'm going to give it a new displacement texture. Then I'm going to click this Show Texture in Texture tab. Give it a Clouds texture. Turn the strength way down. And then we can play with the scale a little bit. Don't want to go too crazy. That's probably too crazy. But maybe if I turn the strength down, it kind of works. Yeah, that works. Okay, so I'm happy with that. So I'm going to hit number pad / again to come out of isolated view. I'm going to grab all the other toruses. And then I'm going to grab the one we were on. And then Control L, copy modifiers. And now they should all have a little bit of displacement on them. Just any imperfections you can add really help. Also, this is a organic material, so I am going to give it a little bit of subsurface, which is just the light scattering through it. Play with the scale a little bit, turn the weight way down. Now, for this table, I am going to give it a wooden shader, and I'm going to grab a CC0 texture, which is copyright free, and I am going to go to ambientcg.com, and I'm going to find a nice wooden texture that I can use for this. So I found this texture. I'm going to put a link to this in the description below, and I'm just going to download it 2K PNG. We get a bunch of maps with this. We get a color map, a displacement map, a roughness, and a normal map. I'm going to use OpenGL one. I'm going to plug the color in first, and then what I'm going to do is switch this to the UV editor, and I'm going to select all the vertices, and I'm going to rotate this so that the wood grain flows the other way. And I'm also going to scale it around a little bit until it looks a bit more realistic. And then back in the shader editor, I'm going to set everything that isn't the color input to non-color. I'm going to plug the roughness into the roughness, run the displacement into a bump node into the height input, plug that into the normal. Then I'm going to grab the normal map, run it through a normal map node into the color input, plug that into the normal input of the bump node, and you can see we get our bump, but it is very, very strong at the minute. So I'm going to set the distance to 0.2, turn down the strength to 0.1, maybe set the distance to 0.1 as well. That's a bit nicer. And you can see we get that realistic shading on the table there. I think I can tweak the hue of this a little bit. I'm going to add a hue saturation value node. Maybe desaturate it a touch, bring it a touch darker. Okay, that's kind of nice. I'm going to grab a camera here. Control Alt number pad 0 brings the camera to view. I'm going to turn on render region, and then I'm going to just play with the position of this camera a little bit by going into the view panel and setting camera to view, and then just sort of finding a nice angle, but where I don't go too low that I don't have to worry about modeling stuff that's not in the frame. So I might do something like this, kind of an interesting composition. And I'm going to set this to a 3D view so I can see where my camera is here. I'm going to maybe set the focal length to be a little bit higher. And I'm also going to give it depth of field. Then I'm going to turn on in the viewport display limits. And I'm going to just set the distance to be somewhere that lines up with the serial here. One thing I forgot to do, but that I wanted to do earlier actually, was all our serial starts in the same grid at the minute, which isn't very realistic. So I'm going to grab all these and I'm going to press F3. I'm going to hit randomize transform. And then in this little panel down here, we can randomize the location slightly. So I'll bring that up on each axis. Randomize the rotation. I'm just going to set it to 360 on every one. It defaults to 180. And then I'll scale even, randomize the scale. Just drag all these at the same time. And I'll do something like that, and that's working pretty good for some more random like serial. Maybe I'll do it one more time, but I will turn off the scale and the random and that and just do the rotations once more. Okay, now to bake our rigid body simulation so we don't have to play the timeline and recache it every time, and we'll also be able to render it now. We just have to go into the scene tab, go under rigid body world, and under cache just hit bake. But you're going to make sure that you don't bake too many frames, so I'm going to bake 120 frames because I think that's going to encompass the whole animation here. So then I'm going to set my scene time to 120, set the end frame to 120 here, just hit bake, and we have this nice simulation. Took about a minute to bake, and we see all our Cheerios falling into the bowl. Quite a lot on the table. What you could do if you didn't like these is grab them all after you know where they land and delete them so that they never get simulated in the first place. But I'm not going to do that here. I quite like it. So the only other real setting to turn on I think is motion blur. And now this is pretty much ready to be rendered, but we still haven't set up our lighting yet. Because remember, we're just using the basic scene world here. So if we actually use our real world, you see everything's just this grey colour. So I'm going to turn off the world. And I'm going to add a couple of lights in here. So I'm going to start with a sun lamp. And I'm just going to give it a bit of a direction. I think that will work. I'm going to turn up the intensity to be something closer to what the real sun would look like. And I think what I'm going to do is I want this to feel like it's inside on a table. So I'm going to make a plane here that to sort of cast some shadows. And I'm going to make it feel like the sun's coming in through a window. So I'm going to make a plane like this, and then I'm going to make a plane on the other side, just a bit lower. Necessarily see that, and then we can just really sculpt our shadows here. And maybe one at the top, because the window would technically stop, so yeah, we could do something like that. That works quite nicely. We just have this fake window that we're never going to see, but it's just to cast shadows basically. And then I think this angles, the shadows are too sharp at the minute, so I'm going to increase this just a touch. And I'm going to add a fill light now, because we have our key, and you notice the shadows get perfectly black because there's no other light in the scene, and that's not what I want. So I'm going to add an area light, and I'm going to pull it up above here, give it a bit of an angle opposite to our sun, and then I'm going to give it a really large shape because I don't want any shadows on this really. Maybe 25 meters, and this just sort of represents any fill from the room, any bounce light, and the blue of the sky, that kind of thing. So I'm going to pull this up to be a little bit bluish, and I'm going to set the strength to be maybe 1,000. We'll see how that goes. Maybe a bit more actually, and maybe we want it more coming from the top. Maybe it's too blue. Could make it, I think that makes the scene a bit too warm. Just play with some colours for this. Can always change our angle a touch. Let's make a roof to this whole thing. Make sure we remove that wood shader from it. I don't think we need that actually. Turn the size down a little bit. Turn it up. See what kind of effect that has. I think our shadows may be a bit too long. That's kind of nice. Let's try hiding this. No, I think we do want that. Ah, there we go. You see, adding this plane here makes this whole scene feel instantly more realistic because we get the bounce light off of the sun onto that. Because, you know, if this were real, there'd be a wall there because this would all be sort of interior. So we can go ahead and add that in. Maybe even catch a hint of it just in the top left corner. And I'll do the same on the other side. And I'll also do the same opposite the window. And you see we instantly get flooded with so much more light. And we don't even really necessarily need the fill light anymore. But I'm going to use it just to boost the blues. I might even add a ceiling. And you can see we're just sort of making the scene more and more realistic every time. Yeah, so without the ceiling and then with is another big difference as well. Okay, I like this. I'm just going to soften the shadows one more time. Something like that. You can really just be creative at this stage and play with any nice shadows you find, any nice lighting setups. Really anything you like at this stage. And I'm going to give this sun a slight yellow tinge. Just to warm that up a bit. Then if I look at our fill light here, I'm going to give that... Okay, nice. I'm going to go ahead and render this out now, because I could sit here and tweak this forever. But sometimes you just got to know when to quit. So I'm going to go ahead and render this.